Okay, so now it's just started recording. Excellent. So today we are blessed to have the amazing Gary Dunnett, our Executive Officer from National Parks Association of New South Wales. Now, Gary is an avid photographer. So he's going to take us through one of his favourite places, his favourite spots, Royal National Park, and some of the photography that he's done in the park. I should just quickly mention, you guys can ask questions in the chat function down the bottom, and I'll be monitoring that throughout the webinar, and then we can ask those questions to Gary towards the end. All right. Thanks, Gary. Take it away.
Thanks, Shani. And if you and Sam can just give me a nod to let me know that things are actually working at the moment, which I'm hoping is the case. Anyway, look, I'd just like to start by acknowledging that I and we all sit on Aboriginal land, never ceded, and pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. Look, I'm not trying to give anyone an overview of an entire reserve. I actually want to go in exactly the opposite direction as it happens. I want to do a deep dive into a very small area. And I guess one of the things that prompted me to suggest this as a topic is the pretty obvious thing that we're all very constrained at the moment. We're stuck with only being able to exercise within our own local government area or a very short boundary around it. I'm incredibly fortunate in that I happen to live in the same local government area as 4 national parks, or 3 national parks and a nature reserve, but I'm really mindful that most people aren't under anything like that sort of fortunate situation. So we're all in a place where we actually need to figure out how we can actually get the best out of what sits there right at our doorstep. And I guess if I think about the way that I know I in the past have approached my experiences in nature, it's sort of got 2 bookends. One of those bookends is really about the new. It's about getting to experience places that you haven't seen before. It's getting to start to thread your way through a world that's much bigger than your everyday. And I find it really interesting when I look at, as Shani said, I've got a bit of an interest in photography. The world's full of photography YouTubers, and they're all going crazy at the moment because they can't get out there and travel the world and photograph that spectacular sunset against the iconic site. And, early in the pandemic, we were seeing people doing YouTube clips of dropping dye into cups and doing macro photography because they couldn't get their heads around how you could possibly do anything else. But of course, there's a whole other great tradition in photography, which is the really focusing on the places that you know. And I guess that's where I want to start today. It's about how you express the way that you feel bound to particular places that have significance to you. For me, it's sort of a few threads come together when I sort of think about that meaning of local places. One is that personally, I find that the practice of photography is a fantastic way of shutting out the clattering mind, of actually sort of focusing right in front of you on what's special. It's a rare opportunity as you sort of work your way through all the sort of conflict and contention of life to actually just settle in and focus on one place. So that's part of it. I guess another issue is that the place that I want to talk today is one that has a really deep personal connection. I grew up on a river, but this is actually a place where a lot of my early experiences with water happened. I actually learnt to swim there. It's a place I learnt to snorkel. It's a place that I took my own children as they were learning to swim. It's got this sort of really special attachment. And I guess the other thing in my case is that in terms of my professional career, I've always focused on small conservation reserves when I was a reserve manager, places like Kamei Botany Bay, Tara Point, Georges River, reserves of only a few hundred hectares. Later, a lot of the small parks across Western Sydney And the thing that always struck me really profoundly when you do a deep dive into these small reserves is that in terms of the sort of the array of conservation values and heritage values they have, they're in no way overshadowed by the large landscape parks. You know, they tend to be places that cram an extraordinary amount into them. And what I'm really looking to do today is to take that principle of understanding what's crammed into small places and really focus it essentially into one little muddy puddle, which is a place called the Basin in Royal National Park. Now I'm going to have a crack at sharing the screen. And Shani, could you just confirm that that's worked?
Yes.
Excellent. All right. So, what's the Basin in Royal? This image is a little bit of a quiz for you for the end of the talk to actually figure out what's wrong with it. But the Basin is a small saltwater creek system in Royal National Park. It sits between the townships of Mainbar on one side and Bundeena, both of them inliers within Royal. The Hacking River's through here. This is a structure called Deben's Spit. And the area I'm going to focus on is just this tiny little green patch you can see in the middle, which is it's the Cabbagetree Basin. And the place really only exists because of this thing. Not the bridge, this is a new version of the bridge, but there was an older predecessor, but it's actually that, and I'm going to say it's a sewage pipe because I don't actually know if it's the water or sewage to Mainbar. I'm pretty sure that it's the sewer. But the whole system actually only exists because of the constriction that happens where the pipeline crosses what was a little estuarine sandy creek. And now you've got this extraordinary Venturi effect created by the water, the tidal waters moving backwards and forwards past that constriction. So instead of just having a big sandy creek, what you end up with is in fact two quite deep areas. So this place that I'm sort of professing this deep attachment to is at its heart actually a highly modified landscape. It's not pristine, it's not wilderness. And like most of the places that we have access to around the city, it's been affected by the history, certainly of the last 200 years, if not the history of thousands of years of human agency in this landscape. So I'm very much going to be focusing on natural processes, but I do want to say right from the get-go, this is a connection to places that in fact are quite modified. Okay, even though it's been modified, it's actually been remarkably stable for most of the last 70 or 80 years. This is 1960, these are out of order, but it's 1961, but this is just a quick run through so you can see essentially each decade that the nature of this little sandy inlet has remained very consistent for the last period. So it's a landscape, as I say, driven by the sewer line that crosses between Mainbar and Bundeena. This is this system looking south. So that's the northernmost, sorry, looking north, this is the northernmost of those deep holes. And as you can see, you've got a big sandy deep hole that's about 5 to 6 meters deep, surrounded by grey mangroves and the shorter river mangroves. Looking north, not dissimilar arrangement. And a bit of a water's eye view of the same system. Okay, so as I said, this is a place that I've got deep connections to, but it's also a place that, in that, I guess that desire to try and unpack exactly how much could be fitted into one little muddy hole of well under a hectare in area, half a hectare at most. I decided 5 or 6 years ago, no, let's call it the great grind of time. It's probably more like 10 years ago to just see what I could document that actually lived in this space. So what I'm going to do is just take you on a little bit of a journey from the top of the system down through it, but we'll start with the open water. So you get species like Australian pelican that sort of utilise these estuaries. And sorry, I'm not sure why the system is, oops, no. Okay, little pied cormorant, little black cormorant. So little pied cormorants are a species that really characteristic of our coastal estuaries, but they tend to be loners. When they're actually hunting, they hunt by themselves. In contrast, little black cormorants, you'll often see them in flocks of up to 60, and they actually drive the fish against the edge of the sandbanks and the seagrass banks to hunt. And then you get these sort of mixed species array. So here we've got little pied cormorant, silver gull, little egret, pelican, white-faced heron. That's about all that comes up in that one. So let's start at the top of the system. So this is a few years ago, but what surrounds that muddy, salty hole is both a mangrove forest, but also some fantastic salt marsh system. So this is looking through the combination of the grey mangroves as the upper story and then the river mangroves down below. There's a really significant difference between these two species. By the time you get down to Sydney, you're pretty much down to just two species of mangrove. The grey mangrove have pneumatophores, which are these aerial roots, so that they actually can breathe and transpire above the water. The river mangroves are entirely dependent on the water receding, and that's going to become a little bit critical as we move along. So sitting up in those mangroves, you've got some really quite skulking sort of characters. So this is a Nanking night heron, which is a nocturnal species. So during the day, you pretty much only see them roosting. Occasionally they'll get up a little higher, and even sort of, if they get spooked by one thing or another, they'll move around. Even more cryptic than the Nanking night heron, a species like the black bittern. This is the only time I've been able to actually photograph this species, and this was the fleeting second between spooking it and it bolting out, never to be seen again. More common around the mangrove systems, we have striated heron, also known as mangrove heron. And they do a lot of their foraging in amongst the mangrove pneumatophores. And then we've got a whole collection of water birds. In this case, you've got royal spoonbill, little egret, and white-faced heron that spend a huge amount of time around the fringe of the mangroves and within the mangrove forest as the white-faced heron. From a photographic point of view, it's hard not to be a total sucker for these guys because of the reflections. It's just, there's something about symmetry that I must admit I find really hard to resist. That's a great egret. One of the things that I find adds a sort of a depth of interest is not just to experience these places, if you like, at the prime times of the day, you know, the classic working hours, getting out there in the dawn and dusk, getting out there when it's abysmal weather, such as the rain, I think really adds another sort of sense of connection to these places. You feel much more part of the whole place in all of its moods. Great egret. This is one of the species which really suffered during the plume collection period of the 1920s and 30s, before that was all outlawed. And again, by going to these places in their different moods, at their different light, you can get some fantastic sort of sights, such as in this case, those shaft of lights just catching the feathers and catching the beak of this great egret. Plus which you actually get to see them living their lives. So in this case, it's, I think, called a little mullet. And every photo blog you'll see gets just entranced by the sort of the hunting of these things. It's one of the delights of modern high-speed cameras, you know, 8 to 1,000 shutter speed, and you get this extraordinary effects from the movement of water as these things sort of dart down. This is one of the sort of characteristic behaviours that the egrets use as they're sort of working their way over the sand flats around the mangroves. That sort of bridling with the wings is they both use the shadow to bring fish in, but also to startle and distract. And the ever-present seagulls are ready to grab whatever they can off the egret. Okay, and a bit of late afternoon. All right, so this image here is to give you a bit of an indication of the, you know, we have things that ostensibly look the same. Two white egrets, and when you see them individually, they really do look very similar. But in this case, we've got a great egret and a little egret, and you can see the size disparity. The little egret coming in there, I find them actually the most entertaining by far of all of the water birds. They're just in constant motion. They sort of alternate between standing still to try and sort of entice things in, and then this sort of incredible dancing across the sand and mud flats. This is behind it. You'll see that's the bridge in the middle of the estuary. And then the egrets all are about really active hunting through the system. You've also got species such as the spoonbill that use a completely different array of foraging strategies. These things have these extraordinary sort of receptors and sensitivities around their bills, and they sift through. They don't have baleen, but there's a lot in common with the way they sort of operate in the sun, in the sand and mud. And again, they're one of those species that when you just walk past them, they appear as simply you know, another white bird on the sand. But if you take the time, if you get close, you actually see what an extraordinary animal they are. In this case, you've got a female and a male that's starting to come into his breeding plumage, but the sort of the color and the form and the shape of these extraordinary animals is something that I'm sure most folk don't actually sort of focus on, and they'll often be foraging in these groups, and their head goes side to side as they're sort of sifting that big white spoon through the mud and sand. In this case, what they're doing is actually working their way through some of the seagrass beds, where you get lots of small invertebrates, you get things like little pipefish, a whole range of food for these guys. Okay, and then we get to what I suspect is what most people are sort of assuming all those white birds are, which is the sacred ibis. Recently, we've also been getting a number of straw-necked ibis, I've noticed, in the Shire as well. But, you know, all that derogatory stuff that people do in the city of referring to them as bin chickens and whatnot, in fact, when you get out into these natural systems, they're extraordinarily cagey ibis. They're one of the ones that's actually hardest to approach. It's almost as though they've got these two totally different modes between their natural behaviour in relatively unaffected habitats and all that stuff that happens around the bins. Also up high, we get these periodic wonderful little gems turning up. So these are the migratory waders. In this case, this is a thing called a double-banded plover, which actually most migratory waders spend they essentially get 2 summers each year by breeding in the Northern Hemisphere and taking advantage of that incredible profusion of life you get over the Northern summer, and then coming and spending their winter or the second summer in Australia. These guys actually just escaped from New Zealand, the South Island in New Zealand, and come and spend their winter over with us because it's marginally better than in New Zealand. Threatened species, they're subject to a number of international conventions. All right, so that's the sort of the birdie bit. I'm sort of now going to move down into the, we'll have a bit of a wander around the mangrove system and the sands around. So this is a spotted smooth shore crab, the ubiquitous soldier crabs, and I'm not sure if Gary Scher's on the call tonight, but Gary did his honours thesis on a couple of the species of the local soldier crabs. Little Haswell's crab, you often find them tucked in under the salt marsh. My personal favourite are these incredible little Semaphore crabs, which sort of spend their time with these unbelievable eye stalks sort of zipping around in the mangroves and sand. And they're not afraid to tell you that you need to back off. You can see the males have this sort of the big forearm. These are the ones that as you walk along, you will just watch the landscape zip away, because what they do is they have a critical distance of a couple of meters. And as you walk, they zip down their holes. And as you pass, they're coming back out of the holes. They spend the low tide eating debris. So you'll get those little balls on the sand where they've sort of chewed away. All right. For those who have an interest in the optics of photography, this is called Snell's window, which is this extraordinary effect you get when you're sort of looking up from below the water, and you get this sort of this cone of visibility around you, where it doesn't reflect, but it actually lets you sort of look through the water. And that's probably the worst explanation you'll ever get a Snell's window. But anyway, so we're out on the sand, but this is really about the heart of this place is the way that the different parts of that saltwater estuary sort of hang together. So here we've got the mangroves, we've got their pneumatophores, and we've got the sort of the sandy habitat below them, and you can see all some of the burrows and holes that are happening there. The mangroves have an extraordinary capacity to colonize landscape. And in a lot of areas, there's actually concerns that mangroves are encroaching on salt marsh systems in particular and starting to choke them out as sea level rises. Unfortunately, salt marshes, it needs slightly higher land than does the mangroves, and as sea level rises, the salt marsh is really getting pressured. But one of the strategies is that they actually drop these in so many ways, an embryonic plant ready to establish itself. So here's the next generation coming up. This is the older generation's pneumatophores, and then you can see these two coming through. It is such a complex and rich environment. You can see the sort of if you like, the basic architecture is created by the mangroves, but then you have these extraordinary layers of encrusting organisms. So in this case, this massive bed of rock oysters, excuse me. I should make the obvious point that at this point in time, I'm using an underwater camera rather than the DSLR. And of course, nearly all of the shots you're about to see are taken at high tide. So this place, the character of it is totally driven by the tidal cycle. Not only is it more pleasant to be snorkeling up above those oysters and the mangrove roots and actually wading through the sort of the thick gluggy mud, but it also, the forest comes alive in a way as the water sort of floods over them that I find really enticing. Sorry, just technologies. Okay. Let's going to go back because yes. Okay. You can see these little ostracochlea all over it. And again, just the sort of complexity of what's going on with these encrusting organisms. I find myself really drawn to the sort of the shapes of mangroves. This is a long-standing sort of fascination, I guess. Okay. And of course, the mangrove system and that interface with the salt marsh is so incredibly productive. You know, it really is the driver of many aspects of marine productivity. These are the little southern glassfish that sort of, you'll see, this is a species you'll often see as these immense shoals of thousands and thousands of small fish. They're only a couple of centimeters long. They've sort of got relatives right around Australia, and in fact, they're a cosmopolitan species, a relatively cosmopolitan species, but they're in absolute abundance through these mangrove systems. And when you're photographing them, especially with a flash, that sort of central body portion's got this amazing reflectivity to it. But, excuse me, but they're far from the only species in this system. So this is your sort of classic small mullet. More glassfish. Excuse me. So what I've been showing you thus far has been, I guess, the fairly orderly stuff where the mangroves sit as discrete structures and tend to sort of dominate the landscape. There's a huge amount of what goes on in the estuary, of course, which is anything but orderly, because in so many ways, a mangrove system is a huge trash collector. It's essentially a sieve. So every tide, everything that floats in, good chance of being collected. I know that there's some mangrove systems, particularly places like Tara, where it's really distressing seeing the amount of rubbish that actually comes down through our stormwater because it just gets totally choked. But much of what's going on in the case of this particular estuary, where the bulk of the catchment is actually a national park, is really different. So what you've got is an extraordinary sort of biological powerhouse that's developed by all this debris that ends up trapped around the edge of the mangroves. You can see a little gudgeon sort of sitting over there. All right, so what I might just mention at this point is in terms of what we're going to see for the next little while, it's all obviously underwater. I feel very much that I've sort of hit photography during the heyday of underwater photography. And what I mean by that is, yes, the cameras have continued to get better and better through time. Certainly SLRs have continued to get better and better through time. But there was a period right at the start of digital photography where there were actually some really, really capable compact cameras being produced that you could put in a small, relatively inexpensive housing. So I've always used to think of this, or the Canon G series cameras, which are only about sort of 10 centimeters by maybe 3 or 4 centimeters deep and 5 or 6 high. And you could put them in a housing that only cost a couple of $100. So it was quite a relatively cheap setup that produced very high levels of control and I think really good image quality, compared to putting an SLR into a full-blown housing that sort of started about 3,000 and 4,000 and goes sort of northward of that. Unfortunately, if there's a sector of photography that's actually gone downhill in the last few years, it's actually those compact cameras. And what's available to us now, you know, the best of them is probably a thing called the Olympus TG6 at the moment. And apart from the fact that Olympus have gone bung, they just don't offer the same level of control that we could have a decade ago. It's it does feel as though we're sort of past this little halcyon period for relatively inexpensive underwater photography. All right, after that little rave, this is your classic sea mullet, and you'll also see there's a nice yellowfin whiting down the top. But again, these are the species sort of moving out over the mangroves during the high. Oh, and it looks like there's little trevally tucked in there as well. But of course, it's not just the fish. A big part of what's going on is the invertebrate diversity. So these are these little sort of saltwater shrimp that you get around the edge of the pneumatophores. And species such as these beautiful little blue eyes, they're actually becoming one of the more popular aquarium fish across the world, Pseudomugil signifer. And they're kept as a freshwater fish, but in fact, they're one of our, and I always get it wrong whether they're anadromous or catadromous, but essentially they're a species that lives most of its life cycle in the salt, but goes up to the interface with the freshwater to breed. And they're just extraordinary to see these little delights sort of flicking around amongst the mangrove roots. And this will be interesting whether it actually works. No, the answer is no, it doesn't want to play video, so that's okay. The other thing is there was a time when I actually quite enjoyed eating prawns before I started to meet them in the water. This is an eastern king prawn. And they're just the most entertaining animals. Like everything in the water wants to eat them, but you know, the whole googly-eyed thing, the sort of the energy of them. Oh, and that's back to one of their smaller cousins, the shrimp. More of these beautiful little hingeback shrimp. One of the great things of those sort of compact cameras I was talking about is their macro capabilities are quite extraordinary. Okay, I'll just check that that's, apologies for the backwards and forwards, it's just the, okay, oh, and the other thing is if there's a species that characterizes the basin, the site we're talking about, it's the hermit crabs. Several species, but every discarded shell, every discarded mollusk shell is a piece of real estate which is very vigorously fought over. Just as I think I've got a picture in later, but you might notice there's this little fortescue here. This is probably the biggest downside of the whole system. You don't want to tread on these guys. They're one of the scorpion fish, and they've got extraordinarily painful sting. These are sea hares. If you touch them, they just release this extraordinary cloud of purple ink into the water as their sort of defensive mechanism. And they spend a lot of time creating more sea hares. But they're one of the species that's constantly browsing any structure. Right, a bit more up amongst the mangroves is your classic yellowfin whiting. Okay, so that's, if you like, the edge of the mangrove forest itself. We go a little bit deeper and we start to move into the seagrass and the algal beds. So this is some of the zoster, which is the narrow eelgrass. Oh, and that's a common toadfish. Oh, and some of those fortescue I mentioned earlier. But there's also this great array of these amazing algae, the macroalgae. And again, as I said before, as you saw with the egrets, I'm a total sucker for these reflections, but in this case, it's from under the water rather than on top of the water. That's one called Neptune's necklace, which you also get in a lot of coastal rock pools.
Gary, just letting you know, it's 4:35.
Thanks for that, Shani. Some species are fry. So I'm going to continue because I don't actually know what species they are. All right, so this is some of the Zostra beds and your classic sort of Luderick. Smooth toadfish. You can get some sense in this. One of the things I find amazing is on a hot summer day, you can actually see the bubbles of oxygen coming up out of the seagrass. And then we're down into the deeper sandy bits, dominated by these macroalgae in the sand beds. This is actually another species of sea hare, but these ones get out onto the sand. More of our little friends, the hermit crabs. Ghost snippers. I got to say, I have a suspicion this was one discarded by an angler. More prawns. Okay. This is the brown saber-toothed goby. Brown saber-toothed blenny. One of the real quandaries, I think, for anyone involved in the management of these areas is how much of the rubbish you pick up. Because the reality is all of those things, like some of these historic bottles, end up becoming someone's home. Okay. Sorry. That's one of the other saber-toothed blennies, the yellow line. And they are called saber-toothed blennies because they've got these wonderful fangs, and you don't want to sort of mess with them too much. This is my absolute favourite species of the basin, which is the southern dumpling squid. They're only about long as your hand at the biggest, but they're these extraordinary little mini predators that prowl the basin, and they were the thing that finally decided to me that I had to take the torch in and start diving there at night. They spend a lot of time burying themselves under the sand. But pretty much all of the behaviours you see from your classic sort of calamari squid, you see in these tiny little guys. Yeah, you can see the eyes from this one. And I'm not going to try and play the video. This is the mangrove goby. Crested mangrove goby. One of the really characteristic species of the estuaries is these weird billowing sort of shapes you see working their way across the sand, and it's the schools of striped catfish. That's a video. Yellowfin brim. Here's some more catfish. Dusky Flathead. A big dusky flathead. Little smallmouth flounder, small tooth flounder. Amazing camouflage on these things. And you can see that whole asymmetry they have going on to flatten. It's a black sole, which is related to the flounders, but they have an integral tail, if you like. Fan-bellied leather jackets, which is one of the characteristic sort of estuarine species right up and down the east coast. Blue swimmer crabs. Lots and lots of blue swimmer crabs. And they're always just a touch defensive. As a photographer, they let you know that you need to keep your distance. Oh, and this is not a blue swimmer crab. This is a mud crab. You can see this one's had a bit of a hard time. Okay, so what I've showed you is really, I guess, a period where I was very much about trying to unpack the diversity of species that were sitting in this place. What I want to just run through quickly now is not so much the diversity of species, but the moods, the seasons, the different sort of aspects of this place and different experiences that I've had of this place. So this was actually going out there at night, wandering the mangroves. And then in the afternoon, I talked earlier about the sort of, and showed you some of the images of the sculptural forms of the mangroves from underneath, from under the water, but the same elegance sort of sits there, chaotic elegance sits there above the water. I soon learnt that the best time to wander around mangroves at night is definitely in winter. You do this in summer and the sandflies just pick you up by the shoulders and sort of fly you away. But in winter, all you've got to cope with is the cold toes. Again, so this is, I just love the combination of that intense light of the late afternoon and that sense of vibrancy and life. You can see the sort of the river mangroves behind, the grey mangroves above, and those intense colours. It's just a place that sings with life. And it's just look at those, all those oysters beneath. All right. And then, as I say, for me, it's a bit about experiencing these places, not just at one time of the day, but actually living the whole day through them. So this is dawn. All right. This image is the air photo from 2018. So everything I've shown you thus far has been pre-2018. As everyone would be aware, we had that amazing, horrific fire season at the end of 2019. And part of what happened as that episode was that you had an extraordinary series of storms in February 2020 that actually ended up reshaping this place. So as I showed you right at the start, for the last 60 years, this thing has flown out past Stephen Smith and out into the Hacking. What happened in February 2020 is that, in fact, the entrance got blocked off during one of the large storms. And there was a period of several months where there was no tidal flow, but there was also major rains. And so what happens, the whole area, in fact, got flooded for an extended period until a new tidal exit was created. So what I'm going to look at now is what actually happened as part of that. So this is the new exit. And as you can see, we've gone from a very muted, slow landscape into some really major transformation. This was a big sandbank for 70 years. It wasn't a natural sandbank. It is, in fact, originally dredged as part of what was a fisheries installation, but it had been there for 70 years and it changed really quickly. And one of the signs of that change was, as I was going back to this site in 2020, I saw the mangroves were dying. Places that had been vibrant and green only a year prior were starting to fall away. And thanks to John Turnbull for allowing me to use this image, but this is a drone shot John has taken, and you'll see here's your bridge. And what's clear is that the river mangroves and the mangroves around the edge of the system have died. We contacted MPWS and the Marine Science Group within that department and said, well, folks, what's actually happening? And I really wasn't sure whether it was going to be a matter of that unbelievable temperatures of the summer of 2019 may have cooked things in this sort of shallow, hot situation, whether it was the escalation of grazing by rooster deer. But what I really didn't expect was the answer, which was that the mangroves had drowned. During that period before the entrance reopened. So look, it feels a little macabre, but I just haven't been able to stop myself from going back to this place. And it's not trying to document something which is gone forever. But I just find myself totally entranced by the extraordinary phase that we're going through in this place, where it's just expressing a totally different personality, and those extraordinary forms of the mangroves are laid bare. Having said it, that it's pretty confronting. But from a graphic point of view, I just cannot stop myself from going back to sort of watch this place in transition. And this is a stand that's just on the side of that bridge. And you'll see there's the same fascination I've shown all the way through with the reflections, but there's a grace about this place that I find strangely compelling. If there's such a thing as old growth mangroves, I'm suggest that this is what we're looking at. It's never more striking what we've lost here than when you're standing there in the cold of a winter's morn, looking out at the sun coming up through, you know, what feels like the hedge of a lost forest. Okay, so I don't want this to get too preachy, but part of, I think, the message that this place is telling us is that we are in a time of profound change, and those changes are never going to be wrought more clearly than on our coastal systems, where the difference in 10 centimetres of height, of water height, is absolutely profound in terms of the species that can survive there. The thing I take huge heart for is that there is a resilience and a capacity for recolonisation in any wetland system that just can't be, shouldn't be dismissed. So there's also, you know, there, in terms of the species that live there, it's still their home, it's still their habitat, it's still a place that they'll look for opportunity. The heron in the forests. Oops. Excuse me. Sacred kingfisher, I don't know whether they've been there all the time, but certainly this last summer was the first time I realised that there were literally dozens of juvenile sacred kingfishers through the forest. I suspect that in the past they just haven't been visible, but now they certainly are. And the reality is that while that awful side of the dead parts of the system are really confronting, and they are portentous about what we face for the future, we can also see the resilience where the cards stack up for a particular individual. So in this case, you've got a mangrove that still has its pneumatophores exposed. This is the new causeway that exits the whole system. So this is actually an image that I took nearly a year ago. It's actually entered in the Nature Photographer of the Year awards, and I was lucky enough to become a finalist in those. And I titled it Spiralling Away. because to me, it's sort of captured not just the loss of the mangroves, but that sense that we were potentially losing control. And that's certainly how I felt about this a year ago. But I've got to say that I went back just in the last weekend and took another image of exactly the same patch of trees that were just as dead. But I also saw lots and lots of life around me. And this is an image that, even though it's very similar to the previous one, there's something about that wall of green that really speaks to me. It tells me that there is resilience, there is hope, there's certainly change coming. And one of the most important jobs that we all have is to make sure that the opportunity for recovery is maintained in our natural landscapes, that these places get the chance to change, to adapt, to survive. We need the reminder that truly hideous things can happen, but we also need to maintain the hope that these places will survive us, and they'll out-survive us as a species, I suspect. There is something precious that we are custodians of here, and we need to treat that really seriously. On that note, I'm going to stop, Shani.
Oh, that's perfect timing, Gary, because I was about to jump in and say we have 8 minutes. Wow, I'm just absolutely stunned by that presentation, Gary. I must say, yeah, you've made me fall in love with the place, and then, you know, then you've shown the devastation that's occurred there. So yes, it's been quite an emotional journey. Thank you for that. There's a lot of comments and a few questions, but I'll pick out some of the questions. So Gary, what would you think, this is from Leah Trebon. Gary, what would you think would be a key indicator of health for this ecosystem? Would it be the mangroves, the water quality, the invertebrate diversity, or something else?
Look, I guess the thing that more than anything else, we know what was there in this system. We're seeing that there is a recovery, certainly of the grey mangroves through it. It's not just a matter of that basic structure of the system has sort of, you know, taken a hammering. We can actually go out there and look at what is still there. I'm not hugely keen to do another winter where I go diving there every sort of couple of weeks through the cold period, but I'm certainly going to do it because I want to know whether those dumpling squid are still siphoning their way around that wetland. So I think it's really a matter of, we need to know these places, we need to be the sentinels for them, and yeah.
So sort of related to that question, and you just mentioned a little bit about the squids in particular. So question from Elizabeth, are the fish crabs still there? So
yes, they are.
Yeah.
They are. Yep.
Some great comments that you should definitely have a look through, Gary. Wow, indeed, Gary, well done. Fantastic photos, extraordinary photography. Okay, there's a question from Rosie. Apart from the deer, have you observed any other mammals?
No, look, I haven't. There certainly are a lot of deer across the mangrove systems. They get in and they not only sort of will chew away periodically at the salt marsh, but they really like sort of stripping away mangroves, and it's a major issue right along the hacking. You've only got to go literally meters up the slope and you're suddenly into bandicoots and sugar gliders and possums and, you know, swamp wallabies and the whole array. But this is a reasonably hostile place for them out on the salt. Yeah. Birds is very different. Lots of birds.
A question from Sarah Jo. So officially the mangroves were affected by the increased fresh or salt water or the height/volume of water in general.
Yeah, it's the fact that the water stayed up for weeks and months. So these mangroves can't be permanently inundated. They actually need that tidal cycle. They can cope with a few weeks of inundation, but they can't cope with months and months of inundation. And what's happened subsequent to that is that with the reconfiguration of the estuary, you've got areas where, in fact, even the grey mangroves have had their pneumatophores buried in sand, so they can no longer transpire. So you've lost those.
Okay. There's a question from Fiona. How deep was the water in the photos were taken in?
So with the exception of one single evening, this was all snorkeling. So the maximum depth is only about 5 meters. There was a night, in fact, not unlike last night, sort of several years ago, when I was in a slightly obsessive phase when it came to doing a Thursday night dive every week. And we had an East Coast low. There was a 5 meter swell right along the coast. And I thought, I'll see if anyone wants to go for a dive at the basin. And to my surprise, managed to get 2 other sort of hopeless cases. And we carried our gear down from Main Bar, jumped in and found that when there's floodwaters on the top, you have a visibility of maybe 0.5 meter. So it wasn't the most enticing sort of scuba experience ever. But it's a fantastic place to snorkel.
Wow, it's pretty enthusiastic, Gary. I'm impressed. Okay, a question from Boyd. Do you think the parks or other authorities should have intervened when the sandbar exit closed? It was very contentious in local communities.
Yeah.
Now we see massive intervention with enormous machinery working for months, building levees, rocks, huge sandbags. Yeah.
Yeah, look, I honestly don't know the answer to that. I think it was an incredibly difficult situation. There was an inevitability that it was going to break through at some point. And look, the same thing happens with all the closed estuaries up and down the coast, particularly down the south coast, that they'll go through a period of years when they're sort of closed, and there's always a lot of pressure to open them again. I guess the thing that I'd point to more than anything else is actually the reality of all those huge earthworks that are having to happen to try and protect the campground. And we need to really take it as a sign of what is sea level retreat going to look like over the coming decades. A lot of community assets, a lot of biological assets are actually going to have to deal with the fact that the seas are coming up. Like this is, we sort of tend to think that sea level rise and climate change will happen gradually, but it's actually these big transformative events that, you know, the nature of coastal geomorphology is not much happens, and then you get a big storm and a lot gets reshaped in one go. And that's exactly what we've seen down at the basin.
There's a lot of questions here and a lot of comments. I see there's there's another 23 new messages I haven't got to, but we're right on 5 o'clock. What do we haven't planned for this contingency? Do you think we should have it online and potentially answer the question? Is there a way of doing that, Sam?
Shani, I'm happy to keep talking for another 10 minutes if people are interested and you want to get through.
Yeah.
I don't think it's going to cut us off, so we can keep.
Yep.
So for those that want to stick around, we can keep it going.
Sure.
Excellent. All right, we'll keep going with the questions then. There's so much interest, so we may as well. Okay, a question from Madeline. Thanks for the beautiful photos, Gary. The deer are a big worry in terms of what happens next. I'd be interested in hearing an ecology perspective and management plans. She lives at Malabar and have seen deer eat the mangrove seedlings and absolutely hammered salt marsh. I'm
assuming that's Main Bar.
Main Bar, sorry. Yes, I don't know the area.
Yeah, look, I can't give an answer from an ecological point of view. I'm not an ecologist. I'm an archaeologist who pretends. Look, I do know from having past involvement in the deer management program back in Parks days that it's really, really difficult to do control in that environment. It's dangerous to shoot over water. In fact, it's prohibited to shoot over water because of the potential for ricochet, and you can't guarantee the capture of projectiles. So this isn't a matter of protecting the mangroves by getting in there and removing the deer. It's going to have to be by, in fact, reducing the number of deer right across the park, and certainly in that northern part. So it'll be an indirect effect, I would imagine. But, look, rooster deer have been part of the landscape of Royal for well over a century now. The problem is that the numbers are only going up. It needs a bit of a paradigm shift in my mind about the way that control's happening. At the moment, it's doing a pretty good job of protecting some of the rainforest patches across the park, but the coastal areas and the mangrove areas are getting hammered, and that can only be resolved by bringing the population well down.
All right, a question from Pete. Do the mangroves filter the water? And I wonder what flow-on effect there is from these mangroves dying.
Look, in terms of the filtration, this is a tidal system, so the water's coming in and out. What they certainly do is capture debris, no question about that. I think the bigger issue, though, is the loss of productivity that's happening. So every leaf that falls into the water is being consumed by bacteria, by invertebrates, in some cases even by some of the macrofauna. So that loss, and we know that salt marsh, seagrass, mangroves are some of the most biologically productive systems on the planet. So it's really, really important that we maintain them, because once upon a time we used to think about this about being all about maintaining fish and edible crustacean populations, because that productivity was all about supporting their fry, supporting their offspring. But now we know it's also about carbon capture, and these systems, all the way from the tips of the plants down into the roots and the bacteria that sit in those muds, are all incredibly important for capturing atmospheric carbon and storing atmospheric carbon securely. So we have to maintain the resilience of our natural systems, because they're the things that any chance of getting through the coming crisis is going to depend on those systems holding as much carbon as they possibly can.
Next question from Elizabeth. Why did we not interfere and open the estuary?
Like I say, the whole question of interfering with estuary closures up and down the coast is an incredibly contentious one. And in this case, I don't know the debate that was happening within government. I can only imagine, though, that given that it is a system that had been open for at least 70 or 80 years, that there was a certain inertia.
Sorry, I'm just...
And I think we've also got to have a look at what happened out of it. It's worth remembering that this is under the dual management of Parks and Sutherland Council. Sutherland Council is responsible for Deeb and Spit. The breach that's actually happened has really put the park's campground under a lot of pressure, and they're having to spend, I'm assuming, hundreds of thousands of dollars to stabilise that southern embankment of it. So again, you wouldn't be surprised at a certain inertia around any decisions to resolve it.
Okay, Gary, there's a question from Catherine. She talks about the complexity of the system with the moving sand and tides and how it all flows, and the management of the system under these circumstances. It seems to her that it merits further research and analysis. Is there any agency actually doing research on this area?
Look, certainly the question we asked of government went to the coastal specialists in Department of Planning, Industry and Environment. If you're going to do this long-term and seriously, I would imagine you'd have to be talking to Manly Hydraulics Lab and get them to set up one of their models. And who knows, this one might be complex enough to actually break the modeling. I don't know, but it's certainly a pretty substantial challenge.
All right, I've got a question from Laura. What is your favorite camera to photograph birds?
Look, for birds, I think there's two pathways you can go. There's actually some super zooms available now, which are both Canon and Nikon have really good ones that are up into the 20 and 30 times zooms. They're limited by having a pretty small sensor, which is in fact part of why they've got a long reach. But if you're just starting, a zoom is a really good way to start on bird photography, because you can start wide and actually zoom into the subject. It actually takes a while to learn to actually see what you're looking for, to go from the naked eye to the high magnification of a telephoto lens. So those super zooms are pretty good. If what you're looking for is good quality, but not total sort of bank breaker, in the Canon world, you know, any of their SLRs coupled with, there's an old 400mm f5.6 or a 100-400, which is a more pricey lens, but it's a modern lens and very fast focusing, which are fantastic. In the Nikon world, any of their SLRs, truly any of their SLRs, plus 300 f4 or there's a more pricey 500 5.6, which is really, really good as well. I'd strongly suggest, though, that people start with one of those super zooms if they're new to it, because it does take a while to get your head around how to get the best out of an SLR system. Is that geeky enough?
I think so, yes. All righty, that's the end of the questions. There are some wonderful comments in there. It's good to see that Elizabeth, who volunteers at the Marine Discovery Centre at Terrigal, would like to use this as an educational resource for the volunteers. So that's excellent. Yeah, that's really good. So yeah, I guess that leaves us to letting you know about next week's presentation. We have Matt McClellan, who's going to talk about building the most detailed and up-to-date map. And then the week after that, we have Dr. John Turnbull, who's going to be doing a presentation on the marine life in our waters. Yeah. So thanks for coming, everybody. You will be able to access this webinar and our previous webinars by jumping onto our website. And I'm also going to do it up on our Facebook page as well. So stay tuned for that if you want to look at the previous ones, or, you know, if you want to pass it on to anyone that may have missed this. Thanks, everybody.